Good morning. My name is Rachel Lawler, and I am a survey analyst with the Public Policy Institute of California. Welcome to our virtual program today, featuring our latest PPIC statewide survey on Californians and their economic well-being. Today's event and the survey are supported with funding from the James Irvine Foundation, and we thank them for their support. For today's program, my colleague, Dean Bonner, will walk you through some of the key findings from the survey, and then we will discuss some of our main takeaways and answer questions from the audience. If you're interested in learning more, the survey and the slides from today's presentation can be found on the PPIC website at ppic.org. Before I introduce my colleague, I have a couple of housekeeping items. As a public charity, PPIC does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. And if you have a question about the survey or anything you see in today's presentation, please send an email to the address that's on your screen now. That's ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. Please remember to include your name and your organization along with the question. I would now like to welcome my colleague, the Associate Survey Director and Research Fellow, Dean Bonner. Dean?
Hi, thanks, Rachel. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. Let me go ahead and share my screen so that we can get started here. I'll first start off by talking a little bit about the PPIC statewide survey. We have a mission to provide timely and relevant nonpartisan data. And we use that data to inform policymakers, encourage discussion, and raise awareness of the critical issues of the day. And in doing so, we've provided a voice for the public and for likely voters. Since 1998, we've actually conducted over 200 surveys and given a voice to over 410,000 Californians. This survey that we're here to talk about today is the third annual survey on the economic well-being of Californians. As Rachel pointed out, it's supported with great funding from the James Irvine Foundation, and that funding allows us to do this survey, but also to include an oversample of Californians with household incomes of less than $40,000 a year. And this allows us to have a really detailed look at this lower income group. The survey was conducted online from October 7th to the 21st using the Ipsos Knowledge Panel. We contacted in total about 2,300 adults. We include the opinions of about 1,300 likely voters. And as I said, just over 1,000 lower income Californians. And the margin of errors for those groups range from 3.3% to 5.2%. And I'll use this time to really encourage you, especially if you're interested in the opinions of lower income Californians, we actually have detailed crosstabs on just that group, which I think are really useful in understanding how lower income Californians are feeling about really their finances and other important issues of the day. So let's go ahead and start off by taking a very macro look at how Californians are feeling about the economic prospects for the next year. Californians are really pessimistic today, with about 7 in 10 saying that they expect bad times financially during the next 12 months. And results today are similar to July, but pessimism is actually up 10 points since April and is up 17 points from a year ago. In addition to having this pessimistic views, these views are very widespread, with 6 in 10 or more across parties, regions, and demographic groups saying this. And so this kind of sets the stage for maybe how Californians are feeling about other issues that we're about to look at. So we also ask a question about whether or not people think that the gap between the rich and the poor is getting larger, getting smaller, or staying the same. And today we find that a record high 7 in 10 Californians think that the gap between the rich and the poor is getting larger. And results have been similar in recent years, including in our last two economic well-being surveys. But the belief that the gap is widening has increased 10 points since 5 years ago. We find that more than 6 in 10 across parties and regions agree that the gap is widening. And while majorities across demographic groups say that the gap is widening, this perception increases with higher education and income and decreases with age. And when asked if the state should do more to reduce this gap, we also find that a record high share of Californians and likely voters say that the state should do this. Both groups are in fact 6 points more likely to say that state action is needed to address this than they were last May. And it's noteworthy that, while 64% of Republicans say that the gap between the rich and poor is growing, just 45% of Republicans say that the state should do more. Strong majorities of Democrats and independents both think that the gap is widening and that the state should do more. Similarly, Californians making more than $80,000 a year are the most likely to say that the gap is widening, but the least likely to say that the state should act on this gap to reduce this gap. And while men and women similarly likely to say the gap is growing, women are somewhat more likely than men to say that action is needed. So the interplay between these kind of groups that acknowledge that the gap is growing larger, but don't necessarily want the state to take action is a notable finding of this survey and consistent with prior surveys that we've done on this topic. Interestingly, despite the fact that 7 in 10 Californians are expecting bad economic times and say that, and the record high is saying that there's widening income inequality, most Californians today are actually satisfied with their household financial situation. However, it's very important to note that just 1 in 5 are very satisfied, while over half are somewhat satisfied. It's also noteworthy that nearly half of those making $20,000 a year or less are not satisfied, compared to just 16% of those with higher incomes over $80,000. Looking beyond income groups, we find that most Californians across parties, regions, and other demographic groups are satisfied, but only about 1 in 4 or fewer are very satisfied. And while most Californians are satisfied with their findings, we find that with their finances, we find that over half of Californians say that the cost of gas and other transportation is causing them financial hardship. Just under half say it's not causing hardship at this time. And the impact of rising gas prices varies across groups with noticeable differences. For example, Latinos are much more likely than other racial ethnic groups to say that gas prices have led to hardship. And notably, hardship is reported by 7 in 10 lower income Californians, compared to fewer than 4 in 10 of those making $80,000 or more. We also find a similar pattern that emerges when you go from lower education attainment to higher educational attainment, with the hardship lessening with the greater educational attainment. Across regions, we find that more than 6 in 10 Californians in the Central Valley and in the Inland Empire say that gas prices have caused hardship, and that's compared to about half in Los Angeles and Orange, San Diego, while just 37% in the San Francisco Bay Area say that gas prices are causing financial hardship for them. So kind of changing it up from looking at finances and personal finance situation to jobs, we find that 8 in 10 Californians view the availability of well-paying jobs in their area as a problem, with 1 in 4 saying it's a big problem. Findings today are nearly identical to last November, while the share calling this a problem was somewhat higher in November 2020, kind of at when the pandemic was really at one of its worst points. Inland Empire residents are the most likely to call the availability of well-paying jobs a problem, while those in the Bay Area are the least likely. And the share calling this a problem declines with rising age and income. And we also find that women are more likely than men to say that the availability of well-paying jobs is a problem. And when asked if they have considered moving outside of their part of California because of the lack of well-paying jobs, we actually find that nearly 3 in 10 Californians say they had considered moving, with most who say they consider moving saying that they would move outside the state rather than elsewhere in California. And these views today are remarkably similar to what we found in November 2020 and 2021, and similar to a similar question that we've asked on this topic over the last few years, with about 7 in 10 consistently saying that they haven't considered moving. And this has been a real topic of conversation. And I would encourage you to look at a recent blog that Eric McGee and Hans Johnson published looking at this topic as well. But in this survey, we find that Republicans are more likely than Democrats, and younger Californians are more likely than older Californians to report having seriously considered moving. Across income groups, we find that lower income Californians are more likely than more affluent residents to say they have considered this. And across regions, those in Orange, San Diego, and Central Valley are the most likely to hold this view, while those in the San Francisco Bay Area are the least likely to hold this view. Changing course a bit, we asked a battery of questions about whether or not anyone in the respondent's household has experienced a number of situations. We've asked 10 items as part of this battery each of the last 2 years. And this year, I'm going to be presenting on 5 of these findings from this year. I would encourage you to go to our website to examine some of the other issues that are mentioned in our report in the crosstabs and the chime trims that are available. This year, we find that by far the most commonly experienced item is that people have driven less because of the cost of gasoline. 57% of Californians and 64% of lower income Californians said that they have driven less because of the cost of gasoline. Across racial and ethnic groups, Latinos are the most likely and African Americans are the least likely to report this. We also find that 1 in 3 Californians report that their household has cut back on food to save money, while 1 in 5 report that they've put off seeing a doctor or purchasing medicine, were unable to pay a monthly bill, or had difficulty paying their mortgage or rent. Among subgroups, we find that Latinos, lower income residents, and those in the Central Valley and Inland Empire were more likely than others to report having these experiences. Notably, on the issue of having difficulty paying rent or mortgage, we find that renters are actually 3 times more likely than homeowners to report that they've had a problem paying their rent or mortgage. I should add that the question on whether or not people have driven less is a new question this year, but in bulk, all of the other questions, both on this slide and the ones not mentioned here, findings have been similar in 2020 and in 2021. We also asked a series of questions in a battery about how much Californians are worrying about a series of different things. In this battery, there are 8 different questions, and we're going to look at 3 of them today. And these percentages that are on the screen show the percent of Californians who say they worry every day or almost every day about these items. These three concerns here were among the highest among Californians, with worry about the cost of gasoline and other transportation being mentioned by more than 4 in 10 Californians, while nearly 3 in 10 worry every day or almost every day about the cost of housing and the cost of healthcare, and 1 in 5 worry about the cost of healthcare. For all of these items, we find that lower income Californians and those with less education are more likely to worry. And once again, we find that Latinos stand out from other groups in the amount of worry that they have about these topics. Notably, for all of these, women are more likely than men to be worried, and findings are similar compared to previous years, and this really illustrates the amount of financial anxiety that we're seeing among certain groups, and this is basically that we've seen over the last 2 years beginning in our 2020 survey. So this has been a consistent finding where there's a large share of Californians, many of them lower income Californians, who are really worried about some of these financial items. And we also asked a series of questions of just Californians who were either full-time or part-time employed at the time when we took the survey. And what we find is that most Californians seem to be satisfied with their job today, but it is important to note that most are somewhat satisfied rather than being very satisfied. Across regions, we find that overwhelming majorities are satisfied with their jobs, but the share who are very satisfied is highest in the Central Valley and lowest in the San Francisco Bay Area. We also find that job satisfaction overall and the share being very satisfied increases with rising income and age. And it's also noteworthy that while overall satisfaction is similar among men and women, men are 11 points more likely than women to be very satisfied with the job that they currently have. We also asked Californians who were employed about some of the qualities and the conditions of their job. These questions include more perceptive qualities like job security and opportunities for growth, as well as items related to benefits that the job offers. So today we find that 8 in 10 employed Californians say that they have at least a fair amount of job security, and notably found that at least 2 in 3 employees across parties, regions, and demographics say that their job had security, with the lone exception of those making less than $20,000, where job security is said to be had by just 53% of those making less than $20,000 a year. Notably, and when we asked if their job offered opportunities for growth and advancement, we find that 6 in 10 adults said that their job did. There's less consensus on this question, but we still find that about half or more across parties, regions, and demographic groups report this, with the exception, once again, of those making less than $20,000 a year, where just 4 in 10 hold this view. Notably, this perception increases with higher educational attainment and decreases with age, and is actually 10 points higher among men than among women. And we also asked about a number of benefits that a job may offer, and found that while 7 in 10 employed Californians report their job having things like paid sick leave, retirement savings, or healthcare coverage, just about half report that their job offers education or training assistance. Once again, lower income employees are much less likely to report this. And additionally, Latinos and those without any college education are less likely than others to report that their job provides this type of assistance. And as we had the first 2 years of this project, we also asked about a number of policies that could improve the economic well-being of Californians. This year, we actually asked about 10 policies ranging from tuition-free college education to job training programs, and found that majority support 9 of the 10 items that we asked about, with the exception being providing a universal basic income for adult citizens, where just under half support this policy. It is noteworthy that support for the 7 policies that we've asked in 2020, 2021, and this year is essentially unchanged. Before diving into a few of the items we asked, it is noteworthy that 4 of the 10 items we asked about had bipartisan support. Those items are increased job training, the idea of a public health care option similar to Medicare, and 2 new policies that we asked this year about making housing more affordable. But now let's kind of dive into these, the first 2 items that we're going to talk about. We find that, strong support for both increasing government funding so that childcare programs are available for more low-income working parents, as well as expanding the eligibility and payment of the earned income tax credit for lower-income families and individuals. Both of these programs are targeted, at least partially, towards lower-income families, and both have strong support of about 2 in 3 Californians, except among Republicans. However, it is important to note that while Republicans don't offer majority support, their support falls just short of 50%, and support for these 2 programs are much higher than it is for other programs, such as eliminating college debt or making college tuition free, where fewer than 3 in 10 Republicans support those policies. I definitely wanted to look at some of the new questions that we asked. These are 2 new questions that we introduced this year, looking at the potential housing policies that are being discussed. And we find overwhelming majorities support policies intended to both increase the amount of affordable rental housing for lower and middle income Californians, and policies that would ease permit requirements and allow for more housing to be built so that perhaps more lower and middle income Californians could afford to purchase a home. On both of these questions, we find at least half across parties are in favor, and more than 7 in 10 across regions, and 2 in 3 across demographic groups are in favor. And while support is strong among homeowners for both of these items, we find that it's actually 12 points higher for among renters on both of these questions. As I said, I'm talking about 4 of these items today, but there are 6 more items, that we do have crosstabs and mentions in the report. So I would encourage you to look at that. And additionally, we have a ton of other topics in the survey, including the approval of the governor and the legislature's handling of jobs in the economy, some perspectives on working for home and preferences for the next year, as well as kind of why people want to work from home, which is really interesting. We also have questions looking at race relations and their impact on economic inequality, as well as perceptions of the Citizens Initiative process. I'd add that on the Citizens Initiative process, Mark Baldessari, the survey director, will have a blog coming out on this topic that is really interesting, looking at how Californians feel about some potential reforms on the initiative process. And with that, I want to remind everyone that if you have a question, please submit your question to ppiceventquestion@gmail.com. And if you could provide your name and the organization you're with, that would be a great help. And at this point in time, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to invite Rachel back to provide some of the takeaways that she had for this survey.
Thanks so much for that really excellent summary, Dean. Working with you on this survey, I know that we had so many interesting topics that you could have covered today, all of which are very timely. And so I think you did a great job highlighting a lot of the important findings in terms of the current economic environment in California. I did want to briefly talk about some of the other topics in our survey that Dean couldn't cover today in the presentation just due to our time constraints. First, I wanted to take a quick look at approval for Governor Newsom and the state legislature in terms of how they're handling jobs in the economy. As I'm sure you all know, Governor Newsom, well, it's not official yet, I don't believe, he was reelected to his second term on Tuesday. And it looks like Democrats will maintain their supermajority in the legislature as well. And overall, most adults and likely voters have approved of the governor in the months leading up to Tuesday's election. And the findings are quite similar when we ask about his handling of jobs and the economy specifically. So we find that 55% of adults and 54% of likely voters approve of Governor Newsom on this issue. And there is general widespread approval for Newsom's handling of jobs in the economy. We find that majorities approve across most regions and demographic groups. The only exceptions are among Republicans and Central Valley residents, where we find that a majority disapprove of him on this issue. And we also find that independents, whites, those with some college education, as well as residents in Orange and San Diego, they're a little bit more divided in their views. But overall, I think the governor does receive fairly positive reviews for his performance in this particular area, despite a strong majority of Californians expecting bad economic times for the state during the next 12 months. And then turning briefly to the legislature, that's a little bit more of a mixed bag. About half of adults and slightly fewer likely voters have approved of the legislature in recent months. That's just overall approval. And Californians today are divided in their views on how they're handling the job and jobs in the economy. So we find 49% of adults approve and 48% disapprove, while likely voters are evenly split, 49 approving and 49% disapproving of how they're handling this issue. And this kind of division trend, if you want to call it that, continues when we look at the data by subgroups. So we find that 3/4 of Democrats approve, while most Republicans and independents disapprove. And regionally, there's only 2 areas where we find a majority approval, and that's in Los Angeles and the San Francisco Bay Area. And again, these mixed results continue among demographic groups, with men, African Americans, Asian Americans, younger Californians, college graduates, and higher income earners approving, while everyone else either disapproves or split in their views. But overall, I think we can say that state leaders aren't faring all that badly on this issue, despite the pessimistic financial outlook that Dean mentioned earlier. Yeah. So another topic I wanted to highlight is one that Dean mentioned at the end of his presentation, and one that I think are quite familiar with, given what we've experienced in the past couple of years, and that is remote work. This is a very hot topic, particularly in certain sectors of the workforce, and I think it's very important given the implications it has for attracting and retaining employees, as well as its impact on where employees live and work. So currently, 35% of employed adults in our survey say that they work remote or work remotely full-time or part-time. And among them, 2/3 say they started working remotely as a result of the COVID pandemic. So I think that really illustrates just how big of an impact COVID had and is continuing to have in terms of the way that many of us are working today. And it's clear that workers don't want the remote aspect of their job to go away. 29% would like to work fully remote for the next year, while 32% would like a mix of remote and on-site work. However, and interestingly, the 6 in 10 who would like to have the option of working remotely at least some of the time, so that's the people that would like either full or part-time work, I think there is a substantial amount of wishful thinking there, because we also asked employed adults whether they can or cannot do their job from home. And just 41% say they can do their job from home, while 61, when we compare that to the 61% who want either full or part-time remote work, we're left with roughly 1 in 5 there who want remote work but don't seem to be able to do it because of their job responsibilities. And we do find that Inland Empire residents, Latinos, those with a high school diploma only, and those making less than $80,000 annually are much more likely to say their job can't be done from home than our other employed Californians. So definitely seems to be more remote work is a bigger privilege for those with higher educational attainment and incomes. And we're just about ready to turn to our Q&A, but I wanted to just quickly mention one final thing, and that is reasons that folks want to work remotely. And these questions were only asked of those who said they either want full or part-time work over the past year. And we find that work-life balance and relatedly less time commuting are topping the list. More than 9 in 10 said that these are reasons they want to telecommute at least some of the time. 2/3 said they want to work remotely because they are more productive at home, while 53% say they are able to live in a different area from their work location. Commute time is less of a factor for Latinos, while greater productivity is less of an issue among African Americans. And the ability to live elsewhere is also less of a reason for African Americans to want to work remotely, as it is for seniors and homeowners, which makes a lot of sense when you think about that. The work-life balance is equally important across regions as well as partisan and demographic groups. So while all of these 4 elements are positives to a majority of the remote workers, certainly work-life balance is a huge component when it comes to the desire to do that. So I just think these are really important for employers to keep in mind when it comes to thinking about how employees want to work in today's job market, and also when it comes to potential candidates and what they're expecting when they're looking for roles and negotiating benefit packages and things like that in this new kind of post-COVID work environment. So we're going to turn now to the question and answer portion of our program and to the questions that you in the audience have sent in. As a reminder, it's not too late to submit a question if you have one. Please send them to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com, and we can go ahead and start with the first one that came in. Okay, what do you make of the high level of approval for the governor's handling of the economy, despite the fact that so many Californians are pessimistic about the state's economic outlook? That's a great question. I'll kick off the discussion, then Dean, you can feel free to chime in at any time. So I just mentioned this in my comments, but I do think that Californians consider the current economic situation as something that is mostly beyond the governor and the legislature's control. We have asked other questions. For example, in our September survey, we found that most Californians also expect bad economic times for the country as a whole. So this problem is not unique to California, and therefore I think that our state leaders are not really getting the brunt of the blame for it. So Californians see it as more of a national or even potentially a global problem, not so much something that California is experiencing on its own. So I'm not sure, Dean, if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also in some ways a kind of, we live in a very hyper-partisan environment. And so when you have, nearly half of registered voters, registered Democrats and independents who are that tend to lean more towards the Democratic Party than the Republican Party, I think it's just, in some ways, just math that, 9 in 10 Democrats or like at least 8 in 10 Democrats, they're supporting the governor. And when you have that high of a share, it just kind of equates to just over half of of Californians saying that they approve of him. And so I think, you have most Democrats supporting, most Republicans or disapproving, and independents kind of in the middle. And that's where I think you end up with this about just over half supporting the governor. And this finding is similar to findings that we've been seeing in surveys for quite a while now, where just over half, ranging from 51 to 55%, have supported the governor on other issues and overall. And so this is a very stable finding. And I think it's in some ways being driven by the hyper-partisan kind of environment that we're currently living in.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point, Dean. Thanks for pointing that out. Okay, we have another question that's come in. This survey was fielded in the weeks prior to the election. Can you talk about how these survey findings help us understand how things went in California on Tuesday? Dean, do you want to start us off on that one?
Yeah, I'll start off by saying that we know mostly how things seemingly are going as far as election results in California, but there's still a lot to kind of be counted here. So far, it seems like I believe almost all statewide races have been called, except for the controller race, and that one is still kind of close between Cohen and Chin. And so, but I do think that it's important to kind of look at how likely voters are feeling about these things. And so I actually was exploring this for a potential blog or something on this. And what was notable to me is that likely voters were pessimistic about the economy and personal finances, but it's not like they were more pessimistic than adults overall. Similarly, about half of likely voters said that gas prices have caused hardship, but once again, the views weren't that different from all adult views. And so while they are pessimistic, it could have been an environment where likely voters were more likely to be pessimistic, and perhaps then you would see results that would be, impacting the election results more. But I think overall, likely voters are pessimistic, and they were definitely had a negative attitude on a number of different topics, but they weren't necessarily different than than Californians overall. And so I think that may be why you're seeing kind of the results that you're seeing. And so that's kind of where I see on this question.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that, Dean. That's really interesting answer. Okay, so we have another question that's come in. Are there noticeable differences across regions in terms of how people are feeling about their economic standing right now? I can go ahead and take this one. It's the short answer is yes, there are some differences that we've seen. We asked about satisfaction with the respondents' current household financial situation, and right around 7 in 10 across the regions say that they're very or somewhat satisfied with their current situation. However, if we look at the shares who are just very satisfied, we find that 14% in the Central Valley and Inland Empire say they're very satisfied, versus about 2 in 10 in Los Angeles, Orange County, and San Diego, as well as the San Francisco Bay Area. So there's a little bit more satisfaction, or those who are very satisfied in those areas than the Central Valley and the Inland Empire. We also find that majorities across the major regions say that they're financially in about the same place as they were a year ago. But LA residents are they're a little bit less likely to say that they're better off than those living elsewhere are. And similarly, majorities across regions anticipate they'll be financially in about the same place 1 year from now. So there's definitely some similarities, but then there also are, a little bit differences when it comes to satisfaction with their current standing.
Yeah. I'd add that, on the broad question of the economy more generally, there is some agreement across regions, but there is about a 15-point gap between the highest shares saying that they're pessimistic or expect bad times, the Central Valley at 75%, compared to Los Angeles at 60%. So it's across the board high shares of folks are saying bad times, but there's a 15-point gap between those. And then the other thing that I mentioned in the actual presentation is this idea of the impact of financial hardship when it comes to gas prices. So there we did see this pretty big difference with, 2 and 3 in the Central Valley and Inland Empire, compared to about half in LA and Orange, San Diego, compared to 37% in the Bay Area. And so that's a huge part of how people are feeling about their economic finances right now. And so the fact that there are these kind of disparate kind of differences, it's somewhat noteworthy. I think it is, it speaks to, the Bay Area potentially being more reliant on public transportation, while Orange County and Los Angeles might be in some ways a little bit more compact, while in the Central Valley and the Inland Empire, it's known that people tend to drive further for work and rely more on cars than, say, in places in the San Francisco Bay Area. And so I think that's an important part of that as well.
Right. Yeah. Very true. Okay, we're almost at the end of our program. I think we have time for one more question. Okay, this is an interesting question. Does the survey shed light on how Californians' views of economic inequality have changed over time? Dean, you touched on this in your presentation, but there was another question we asked that we didn't have time to include, so I just wanted to briefly touch on that before I turn it over to you. We asked respondents how much they think racial and ethnic discrimination contributes to economic inequality in this country. We do find that 29% of adults said it contributes a great deal, and another 41% said a fair amount. So that's, quite a substantial, roughly 7 in 10 saying they believe that racial and ethnic discrimination contributes to economic inequality. And these views have held steady among all adults since we started the survey series in 2020. There's been a little bit, as I'm looking at the time since, there's been a little bit of fluctuation among likely voters since last November. Last year, 39% said that discrimination contributes a great deal, compared to 30% this year. So that's 9 percentage points lower. However, if we look at it overall, those saying great deal or a fair amount, there's 68% of likely voters who are in that category versus 71% last year. So really, I think it's more of a softening a little bit in the intensity of these views rather than a change in opinion. So Dean, did you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, I did kind of mention that, when it comes to how people are feeling about the gap between the rich and the poor, we've always found, dating back, 5-6 years, that, at least 6 in 10 have felt this way. Now, there is, I think, an increase of 10 points over that time, but it started off at a very high place. But I do think that kind of the pandemic did have an impact on what's happening with income inequality. And so I think that Californians are recognizing that, as well as the fact that, we've seen kind of growth more at the top end than at the lower end. And so I think people are rightfully recognizing that this gap has been growing. And definitely I would encourage you, if you have interest in income inequality, to read some of the work that Sarah Baum and some of our other folks here at PPIC have done, digging into the data, specifically looking at how things have changed over the pandemic, as well as further back. And so I would just encourage you to take a look at that.
Definitely. Yeah, there's some great stuff on our website on that. So with that, we have reached the end of our program. And I would like to thank you, Dean, for your great presentation. And I'd also like to thank our survey funders again. And finally, thank you to all of us that are in the audience for joining us today online. If you pre-registered for this event, later today you will be receiving a survey And we would greatly appreciate you taking just a couple minutes, it's quite a short survey, to respond and let us know how you did. So please take care and have a wonderful afternoon.